Good morning and welcome. Welcome again today to our daily word on this cold Wednesday morning. Beautiful sunshine, but a cold day as we gather again around our phones and computers and our tablets to hear scripture, to talk about what it means for us, to contemplate how it might affect our lives today as we live them and in the future as we live them together. Today is day the word number 845 as we continue our journey together. So, as always, I'm glad you could carve out time to be with me and spend time with me and offer greetings and to just share in this ongoing long journey that we have together of all of these days. So, it's hard to believe we're in 2024 and that this started almost 4 years ago in our conversation. So we'll talk more about that as we approach the anniversary date of that. Good or bad, the anniversary date of that. So I've chosen for this morning 1 Peter chapter 3. I initially said verse 8, but I decided to add verse 9 to this. So the first 7 verses, if you were to look at it, the first 7 verses talk about husbands and wives, and we might have a conversation at another time about what Paul says and whether we agree or disagree about what he has to say about that. But he gives these a lot of words in verses 1 through 7, but then we get to verse 8. And after giving all of that, much of which I don't particularly agree with in his conversation, given our culture today, he finally says, finally. And then he says this, finally, all of you have unity of spirit, sympathy, love for one another, a tender heart, and a humble mind. Do not repay evil for evil or abuse for abuse, but on the contrary, repay with a blessing. For it is for this that you were called, that you might inherit a blessing. So Paul gives lots of words in the first 7 verses, like I said, and then he kind of sums up and kind of changes his tune maybe even a little bit with these particular verses. And, we really, in our lives, always, from the day we're born until the day we die, we have a deep desire to be in community. And we find community in lots of places. When we're kids, when we're kids, we find community in school and in school functions and on teams and sports teams. Carter, my oldest grandson, who you saw the other day on the video, he's in school, so he's learning all of these things that I don't necessarily love, but he got to go to his first birthday party last weekend. We have this deep desire to be in community, and he had a great time. It was at the Y. We get older, we find ourselves in churches and service organizations. We find ourselves on adult sport teams. We find ourselves in study groups. When we work, we find ourselves in community where we work. Not always great necessarily, but we find ourselves in community. And Paul suggests to us that our deepest desire to help create a community really has to do with love. And the love that's available and the love that's ours that we share in the world. Our mission, our overarching purpose is to love. Now, there are lots of ways to make that purpose concrete in our lives, right? We know how we share love with each other and love in the communities that we find ourselves. It's an incredible thing. Here we find that Paul reminds us to have unity of spirit, sympathy, love for one another, a tender heart, and a humble mind. Sympathy, love, tender hearts, humble minds. That's how we find unity. That's how the world, how we gather, and then we share our love with those who are around us, and how important and how incredibly important that is in the communities that we live in. But then he offers this next bit of advice for us, of guidance of how we're called to live. Do not repay evil for evil or abuse for abuse, but on the contrary, repay with a blessing. It is for this that you were called, that you might inherit a blessing. You know, we've fallen so far in our political spectrum and conundrum and whatever you want to call it, that you know, folks want to get elected now so they can have retribution against their enemies. That's why we fight wars too, right? We just want retribution. And now this war in Israel with the Palestinians, they seek retribution but don't know enough to stop. We find it in our own culture, right? We say often that paybacks are heck, that karma is going to get you. We say that, you know, you'll get yours. You know, the list goes on and on, right? We have all of these things about retribution. But Paul says to us, if we're really going to live in community, and if community is what we're called to be about, if we desire to live in community and share our love with the world, and if our overarching purpose is to love, then Paul says to us, we don't repay evil for evil or abuse for abuse, but we repay it with a blessing. That's what we're called to. And when we do that, we inherit a blessing. Isn't that an interesting and different way to look at how we're called to live our lives and where we're at in our culture now, and how if you and I would live differently and live like this, it might be different, at least in the communities. It might be different, at least in the communities that we live in. It is for this that you were called, Paul says, that you might inherit a blessing. So what is it in us and through us that we're called to live? To love one another, have a tender heart and a humble mind, and to really consider that before we interact with the person, even in an immediate notion, before we interact with them. To have unity of the Spirit, and then not seek to repay, and not seek to lash out with you'll get yours or whatever it is that we might say, but instead to repay with a blessing, so that we would inherit a blessing. I know all of us, you know, we've been blessed in our lives by many people, and we haven't considered it like this maybe, but maybe we should, that blessing is something that we have inherited. And when we inherit something, we want to pass it down, right? We want that to be part of our legacy. So I would hope that you and I, in our lives together, in our seeking of community and the communities that we live in, that we would take this to heart. In our deepest desire to help create community, that we do it with love, and we repay everything with a blessing. So that's our word for today as we live our lives together. As always, thanks for joining me. As always, know of God's love that surrounds you, know of my love for you, and I will look forward to seeing you tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. Have a great day, my friends.